Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for a Pearson-sponsored webinar, The Research and Development Behind the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, 3rd edition. I'm Carissa Reedy with the Virtual Events team, and I'm glad you could join us. I hope that you find the information being presented today valuable. Before we begin, I'd like to point out a few housekeeping items. First, you have a control panel located on the right-hand side of your screen. The orange arrow, top left, allows you to hide or expand this control panel. The round blue button allows you to move to full screen mode and back. Your control panel also has audio options. You're able to listen to the audio portion of this webinar through either your computer speakers or your telephone. Since we are recording today's session, all lines have been automatically muted. Next, please note that you have the ability to adjust the way that the items on your screen appear. Use the Layout drop-down at the top of your monitor to make adjustments to your preference. To participate in the question segment, please type your question in the question box on your control panel and click Send. Feel free to send in questions at any time. Questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. Also, please note that we have the presentation slides available for you to download during the webinar. You can find these on your control panel under the Handout section. With that said, I'm so happy to introduce our presenters for today, Mark Daniel and Carrie O'Meara. Mark Daniel is a Principal Research Scientist at Pearson in the Learning Assessment Products Group. He has spent more than 30 years working with assessments in both the test development and psychometric areas. Carrie O'Meara is currently a Senior Product Manager for the Classroom Assessment Products Division of Pearson. Carrie has been with Pearson since 2006. She has a particular focus on K-12 formative, diagnostic, and ability assessments, including the NNAT 3. Thank you both so much for being here with us today. I will turn it over to you now.
Okay, thank you so much, Carissa, and thank you all for joining the webinar today. Today's agenda, I will be going over a product overview of the NNAT 3. I'll also be going over some differences between the 2nd edition and the 3rd edition of the NNAT. I'll then pass it over to Mark Daniel to go over the research and development behind the NNAT 3, and then we will go over some questions and answers at the end. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and jump in. So first, I wanted to have mention a couple points about gifted education. So children who may not have the academic skills or command of the English language to do well or excel in school can also be very smart or gifted. I think we can all agree with that. These children can become very knowledgeable or talented given the opportunity to learn. I think we can also agree with that point. How can all children be selected more equitably? So I think, we here at Pearson have the assessment, the NNAT 3, that I think, does a great job of doing that. So we can go ahead and jump in and provide an overview of the NNAT 3. So what is the NNAT 3? The 3rd edition of the Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, it continues to effectively evaluate general ability, and this is similar to the NNAT 2, for the entire student population. So that includes several different students within the population. So that would be all underrepresented groups from diverse cultural backgrounds. So some examples are listed here. English language learners, Hispanics, African Americans, Native Americans, deaf or hard of hearing children, or also twice exceptional students. This also includes gifted and talented students, but it also includes students whose economic or social circumstances have limited their acquisition of knowledge and verbal skills. So those students that have limited education backgrounds. So speaking a little bit to the test format, so the NNAT 3, and this is very similar to the NNAT 2, is a 30-minute time test. And we always say, we allow 15 minutes for login and instructions to the students, and that includes the sample items. So overall, the administration time is about 40 to 45 minutes, but the test itself is a 30-minute time test. There are 48 items performed, and again, that's similar to NNAT 2. It requires no spoken or written language. The items consist of geometric shapes that are universal and have no verbal content. The directions are pictorial with minimal verbal instructions. So you're starting to see a pattern here that all of these qualities, the utility is great for students with a diverse background. And there are multiple administration options, and we'll speak a little bit more to that, but the exciting thing about the NNAT 3 is in addition to online administration and also paper and pencil, which isn't going anywhere, we also have tablet administration, which is exciting. So now you can give the NNAT 3 on a tablet, so an iPad or an Android or a Chromebook. So jumping a little bit further into the items, so the NNAT 3 items, they utilize culturally neutral shapes and designs. They're designed to require minimal motor skills, and they're designed to require no receptive and or expressive language. And they also provide a graduated range of difficulty for identifying gifted, talented, and advanced students. So here, the item design as well, all items share the same essential requirements. So the student examines the relationships among the parts of the design or the matrix, and then determines which response is the correct one based on the information inherent in the item or based on the stimulus. So you can see here, this is an example of our pictorial directions. This allows the student to figure out how to take the test without actually reading directions or having to rely on text. So what's the difference then, with the NNAT 3? So for those of you who are familiar with the second edition of the NNAT, what makes it, the NNAT 3 different? So the NNAT 3 improves on the most trusted name in the general ability testing, and that's Naglieri, with the following features. So there are newly developed items for grades K through 4, and there are new norms for grades K through 12. And Dr. Mark Daniel will get into this a little bit more into more detail, but essentially for grades K through 4, we have 2 forms, and that's what this third bullet here mentions. So there's increased security with 2 unique forms per level, and that's for grades K through 4. But then for grades 5 through 12, we also generated new norms. We have new norms for K through 12, but the new content is for our lower levels, levels A through D. The exciting thing, like I mentioned earlier, is the tablet and Chromebook administration options. So that now allows our customers to have multiple options for administration, not just online and paper, but also now via tablet. And then we also have a new online interface, so a brand new platform for the NNAT 3. And here's a chart just to break it down. So similarly to the NNAT 2, we have levels A through G. And just to drive home again, so we can see here we have 2 forms for levels A through D. And then for levels E, F, and G, we still have the 1 form, but what we did was we took the content from NNAT 2 and we renormed it and put it on our brand new platform. So we have 1 form for levels E, F, and G, and 2 forms for levels A through D. So just some points here on the scoring and reporting of NNAT 3. So NNAT 3 yields multiple scores, including scale scores, the Naglieri Ability Index, or the NAI, which is a similar, all of these are also provided for NNAT 2, but percentile ranks, stanines, and normal curve equivalents, or NCEs. NNAT 3, the data is available within minutes. So once you give the test, the data is then sent to our platform and is available within minutes, which allows for effective placement and instructional planning. And that's through our platform. Reports for the NNAT 3 include student and home reports, and those are both available in English and Spanish. It also includes group reports, and it also includes a master list of test results. So again, this is very similar to the options available for NNAT 2, but wanted to point out that these are also available for NNAT 3 as well. So none of those reports have gone anywhere. They're also there for NNAT 3. And then also, hand scoring, manual score entry, and Pearson scoring services are still available for paper customers. So you have that option if you do want to give the NNAT 3 paper and pencil. We still have several options for you available for scoring. And without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Mark Daniel to now go in and discuss the research and development behind the NNAT 3.
Good morning or good afternoon. This is Mark Daniel. Again, thank you for being here. I hope everyone can see my screen. As Carrie mentioned, whoops, yes, very good. These are were the objectives that the development team had for NNAT 3 at levels A through D to have entirely new content. And our reasons for wanting entirely new content were primarily to refresh the content for the purposes of avoiding the inevitable effects of content exposure, which is true for any test that's been out for a number of years. We want to minimize the extent to which people in the public become familiar with existing content. And we also took advantage of this new content to introduce some new variations on the already existing item types. At levels A through D, we have two parallel forms. These two forms are completely non-overlapping, so that further reduces the effect of item exposure. So students who take Form 1 at a level will never see items that are also on Form 2 and vice versa. And this is useful when thinking about a retesting situation. So you can think of levels A through D as really consisting of two independent forms, Form 1 and Form 2, each of which has some vertical linking across levels A through D, but no common items between Form 1 and Form 2. It does have vertical linking between levels within a form, but there are fewer common items between levels than was the case for NNAT 2. There are about 15 common items across levels, and there were more than that with NNAT 2. So overall, the effect is a substantially greater number of new items and unique items on NNAT 3 compared to NNAT 2. At all levels, NNAT 3 has new norms, and these norms include high ceilings at all ages. So at all ages, students can obtain the maximum NAI of 160. The first step in creating NNAT 3 was of course to write items, and Dr. Naglieri created the items for the NNAT 3. The initial pool was 480 items, and these were novel, for the most part, novel variations on the earlier item types of NNAT 2. These were classified into 6 broad types and then 96 subtypes, detailed subtypes of those broad types. And we consider all of these types and subtypes to measure the same general ability factor. This is not a multi-dimensional test, but it was important and very useful to do this classification in order to control the content across forms and across levels. So that by doing this subtyping, we were able to say that the two forms at a level would be parallel to one another in the kinds of items that they contained. And for that reason, the items were written in pairs to support the parallel forms. So the trick was to write a pair of items that were similar enough that they were clearly involved the same reasoning process, but not so similar that they were trivially different. In other words, just a color variation would not qualify as enough to differentiate the items in a pair. And finally, we used a new color palette in NNAT 3 to make further certain that the test would be accessible to students with color blindness. The author developed the color palette. We had it evaluated by a specialist, an expert in color perception at the University of Washington, and also tested all the items using software that replicates or simulates how a colorblind person would view the item for a wide variety of types of color blindness. Next, once the items had been reviewed, had been edited, and had been initially approximately assigned to difficulty levels, we conducted an item tryout. We used a representative sample of the new items in this tryout. This sort of leveraged our understanding of items from the years of experience with the NNAT development. And we also included in this tryout anchor items, which were items that are very similar to NNAT 2 items in order to be able to make an approximate linking between the set of new items and the NNAT 2 scale. And that would be important to be able to then create final forms that would be appropriate in difficulty, be comparable in difficulty to the NNAT 2 forms. The tryout was conducted in the spring of 2014. All of the administrations were online. We had a bit over 1,000 students at grades pre-K to 4. It was a demographically diverse national sample, and We basically were looking in the analysis of results primarily at the validity of each item, that is, its correlation with the total score. In other words, asking the question, does this item measure well the same thing that the total test is measuring? We also were looking at item difficulty by age and looking at the performance of all of the incorrect options, the distractors on the items. We did not do bias analysis or diff analysis because of the long standing knowledge that these items do not show ethnic diff. And again, we use the anchor items to guide the placement of the items on the standardization forms. So these standardization forms, we built them to mimic the final forms. So 48 items on each form. We had 3 forms at each of the grade levels. Form 1 and Form 2 were designed to be the final forms, so they had the full range of difficulty and the full range of item types and subtypes. And they were parallel to each other in content but had no common items. Form 3 was an equating form, and it included 15 items from Form 1, 15 items from Form 2, and each of those sets of items was a representative subset of the items on Form 1 or Form 2. And then it also included 9 pairs of items that are not on Form 1 and Form 2 that were essentially backup or potential replacement items in case any of the items on Form 1 or Form 2 did not work well enough to be included in the final form. These were potential replacement items that could be slotted in. And we had vertical linking within Form 1 and within Form 2 of about 15 items per pair of vertically linked forms. Standardization occurred for levels A and D in the 2014-15 school year with a bit over 10,000 students. This came from 27 states. And the sample is representative of the national population on a variety of demographic characteristics that you've seen many times in test manuals, and I'll show you the details in just a minute. The sample did include students with disabilities or 501 classifications, so we told the schools that they needed to include all students who were in the classrooms unless there was some reason such as a perceptual or physical disability that prevented them from taking the test. In other words, all students for whom the final test would be appropriate to administer. And at levels A through D, ELL representation was 24%. All the administrations in standardization were online. We really emphasize online administration, which is the way that most schools are using NNAT currently. Even though it was online, we did do the administration one-on-one at pre-K, and then switched to small groups at K and grade 1, and then full classrooms starting at grade 2. The age range for levels A through D is from 4.0 to 11.11. 4.0 is the same starting age as the norms for NNAT 2. And the reason that we went up to 11.11 in the norming for levels A through D is that even though it's rare for an 11-year-old to be in grade 4, which is the grade level where level D is administered, in order to capture a representative sample of 11-year-olds, we needed to sample at grade 5, and that's what we did in the norming, so that the norms can cover virtually all students in grades K through 4. Let's say a word about the preschool norms. As you probably are well aware, the task of NNAT, the figural, nonverbal, matrix reasoning kind of task, is simply not very appropriate for the average 4-year-old. However, there are situations where users are working with a group that is high ability, and they're using it perhaps for gifted, talented selection purposes in with a preschool sample, and they want to use the test below age 5, and so that's why the norms are provided. But the NNAT 3 is not recommended for use below kindergarten. This is a description of the distribution of cases by age, in the norm sample for levels A through D. And this is a description of the demographics showing a very tight match to the U.S. population. We did do some weighting of the sample to make sure that we did match closely, although we also relied primarily on the sampling process to achieve this similarity of distribution. In designing the final forms, I mentioned that we had form 3 at each grade level in the standardization and as a source of potential replacement items if they were needed. And so we did wind up having to make some replacements and some shifts of items across levels in the final forms. So the reasons for doing this were either some flaw in the item that became apparent after standardization, such as a poor item total correlation or a problem with the behavior of distractors or some other difficulty. And in those cases, we would pull from the equating form to find items that were of the appropriate level of difficulty and had already been calibrated with the Form 1 and Form 2 items. And the other reason, for making adjustments in the item content was if we did find that some of the forms were not as difficult, did not have the high end that we needed. And so we did pull some items from higher levels within a form into a lower form to address that problem. And you can see here that the number of items that were replaced by form between standardization and final, averaging about four per form. Now let me just shift to the levels E through G. As Carrie mentioned, what we did here was a renorming of the NNAT content. We did this in the spring of this year with almost 10,000 students, in this case from 23 states. And the age range here started at 9 years, 6 months. And since levels E through G are given at grades 5 and above, age 9 is quite a young age. You would find very few 9-year-olds in grade 5, but you do find some. So in order to cover the norms for age 9.5, we started the sampling at grade 4. We did not do norms for age 18, which NNAT does have norms for age 18. It would have meant a substantially different kind of a sampling process because in order to have population representative norms at age 18, you need to include not just students, 18-year-olds who are in school, but you also need to include all 18-year-olds who are not in school, whether they're in college or whether they're they're working or they've dropped out or whatever the case, they graduated and dropped out or dropped out, whatever the case may be. And that would have been a very different kind of an endeavor for the norming. So we decided, considering the ages and grades at which this test is used, to stop at age 17-11 and use the data that we could collect through schools. Okay, I've already mentioned why we started the sampling at grade 4. The renorming at levels E through G also represents the national student population. And again, for the same reason, we required the participating schools to include all of their students in the norm samples if they were participating. Here, the ELL representation is 7%. It's lower than at the younger grades, and that reflects what is true in the general population. And all of the administrations were online. This gives you the distribution of cases by age in the upper grades norm sample, and the demographic distribution, again, very closely matched to the U.S. population. So just to summarize what we obtained as a result of the norming and the renorming, a new feature of the NNAT 3 norms is that up through age 9, in the levels A through D norms, the norms are reported in 1-month intervals. And that's to be more sensitive to the relatively rapid rate of growth in performance on NNAT at the younger ages. So what that means is we picked 1 month because that's an interval at which you won't find a student jumping in their NAI score by more than 1 point when they transition from one age group to the next age group. When the intervals are wider and when growth is rapid, you might find that the student might have an NAI score that is several points higher or lower depending on which side of the break they are between two age groups. So we made those age groupings very narrow. Starting at age 10, the intervals are 3 months as they are on NNAT 2. As I mentioned earlier, you can obtain an NAI of 160 at all ages and test levels. There are separate scaled score ranges for levels A through D and levels E through G, and this is something that was required because it was not feasible for us to put the scaled scores for levels A through D from the newly developed forms onto the scaled score range that previously existed for NNAT 2 and that is used for levels E through G. So the raw score to scale score conversion is onto a different set of scaled scores for levels A through D and as compared to E through G. And in order to prevent accidental mistakes of looking up the wrong norm table with a scaled score, we created the scaled scores for levels A through D so that they don't overlap at all with the scaled scores for levels E through G. Finally, something that we're very excited about is within the next several months, NNAT 3 will provide a user-controlled ability to create local norms. It will require a minimum of 100 cases, but these cases can span several ages or grades, or can span several years of time. In other words, could include fifth graders across several different school years. And the reason it's able to do this is that it uses as the input the national NAI scores that are obtained from the national norms. So these national NAI scores already make adjustments for age changes, and so it's possible then to combine students with different ages into a single sample that can be used to generate local norms that reflect the performance of the local population. So that with local norms, you'll find that the average student will obtain an NAI of 100. One of the things that was looked at very carefully was, is there a mode effect? That is a difference between performance if the student takes the test on paper and pencil versus taking it online. This was studied back in 2007 when NNAT 2 was published with more than 9,800 students. And at that point, whoops, I left that. I'm sorry, I meant to go back and fill in these particular numbers. The difference is approximately 3 NAI points between performance online and performance in paper and pencil, with higher performance on paper and pencil. And so for that reason, the levels E through G scoring uses separate conversion tables from raw scores to scaled scores. And this conversion eliminates any effect of the mode. So once you score the test using the appropriate raw score to scaled score conversion for online or for paper, you get a scaled score which will be the same regardless of which modality they use to take the test in. So the question was, what would we find if we looked for mode effects in levels A through D? So during the revision and norming of levels A through D, we conducted a large study during the standardization, and we included about 450 students at each of the 4 NNAT 3 levels, A, B, C, and D. All the students took Form 1 first, and then after 1 to 4 weeks they took Form 2. The reason we kept the form sequence constant for all students was to eliminate any possible impact of form differences, however slight they may be, on the analysis, controlling that source of variation. Half the students took the digital first and then paper second, and half took paper first and online second. And we analyzed this by using multiple regression, where we predicted the time 2 or the Form 2 scaled score from the Form 1 scaled score, and also from whether the Form 2 test was given online or with paper. So the rationale is, if, let's say, mode A is easier than mode B, then if Form 2, the second test, is given using mode A, you would expect a higher score on Form 2 than if Form 2 is administered using Mode B. And we also included the interaction of the form, the modality, with the initial level. So that means that you're able to see if there might be a mode effect that would be different at different levels of ability. It's possible, for example, that perhaps lower ability students show more of a difference between paper and online than higher ability students do, or vice versa. So the results, at every grade, every level I should say, there was no statistically significant interaction at the 0.05 level, indicating that we didn't have to worry about differential mode effects by grade level, and we could ignore that in the remaining analysis. And at every level, the scores were significantly higher with the paper administration than with the online administration. And as you can see, it's about the same magnitude as had been found in 2007 for the NNAT 2 at levels E, F, and G. So overall, we have a very consistent finding of higher scores with paper than with online. We don't know why this is the case, but it certainly seems to be very robust, and so we take it seriously and adjust for it in the scoring. So at all levels, NNAT 3 scoring uses different raw score scaled score conversions. So to make the scaled scores the same regardless of what modality is used for the administration. Internal consistency reliability is the primary measurement of how accurate a test score is. At levels A through D, because we did make some changes in the item content of some of the forms, as I mentioned earlier, that meant that it wasn't possible to use the most commonly used methods for internal consistency reliability, coefficient alpha or odd even split half kinds of methods. However, there is another method which is widely used, although it's fairly new, which is called marginal reliability. And marginal reliability was invented when computer adaptive testing became practical. Because in computer adaptive testing, obviously, it's an extreme example where different students take different items. So traditional methods of reliability calculation just don't work. Marginal reliability takes advantage of the fact that the item response theory technology, or the raw scaling that underlies the test, tells you what the standard error of measurement is for students at any level of ability, any raw score level, as a function for that particular set of items. So we can take this set of items on any given form for NNAT 3 and look at and calculate the standard error of measurement for students who obtain a particular raw score on that form. And then we use that along with the variation, or the standard deviation of ability scores in that sample to calculate the reliability. And this result agrees very closely with alpha or split half methods, and it's a widely used approach. At levels E through G, because we didn't change the content, it was possible to compute alpha or split half reliability, which we did to replicate the results from 2007. Just to illustrate what I mean by calculating the standard error of measurement for any given raw score, this is an actual example of Form B1, Level B, Form 1, NNAT 3, showing the standard error of measurement at each raw score from 1 to 47. And so what we did was to look at the distribution of raw scores in the norm sample who took this form, and we know how many students obtained each raw score. We know what the standard error of measurement is at that raw score, and so we can find an overall average of the standard error of measurement for this form, and that's used then to calculate the reliability. These are the reliability results for all the levels. Again, the marginal reliability for A through D, and the odd even reliability for E, F, and G. So all the reliabilities are between 0.8 and 0.9. We also looked at alternate form and retest reliability. Alternate form for levels A through D, where the alternate forms exist, and retest reliability, we're just reporting what was just, found in the 2007 standardization of NNAT 2. So at levels A through D, we had 524 students from the norm sample who were given both forms in counterbalance sequence. All the administrations were online, and half of the students took Form 1 first and then half took Form 2 first. And the average of the Form 1, Form 2 correlations from the two sequence groups was then the measure of the alternate form reliability. And that is shown here. We have both the alternate form for levels A through D and the retest reliabilities from the 2007 standardization for levels E, F, and G. And as you can see, these are a little lower than the internal consistency reliabilities, which is typically what you find, but they're also quite high. One of the questions that people often have about any ability test, particularly one like NNAT, that intentionally provides content that requires students to solve novel problems, not the sorts of things that they see every day in their class, is what is the impact of taking a test a second time? What is the effect on their second score? So we looked at the order effect, or also known as the practice effect. We had a number of different sources of evidence for this from our current work and also from the 2007 standardization. And we found very consistent results across these various studies. So we're seeing in the alternate form study that I just described for levels A through D, a practice effect of 3 to 5 points. We also, for levels A through D, had the modality study, paper versus online, which in addition to evaluating the effective mode, also told us about the alternate form correlation. And it's a similar range of values. The retest study from 2007, values again between 3 and 5, and the correlation study that I'll describe in a minute with NNAT2 showed a very similar order effect or practice effect. So overall, one can say that there's about a 4-point difference if students are given NNAT again within about 4 weeks. You would expect scores to be about 4 points, NAI score points higher, which is about 1/4 of a standard deviation. So this is something that users should be aware of when they are considering retesting. And it doesn't seem to, interestingly, it doesn't seem to make a difference whether it's a retest with the same form or whether it's a different form. You can't quite be certain of that conclusion because the retest is only at the upper levels and the alternate form is only at the lower levels. But it does appear from the data that we have that in both cases there is a practice effect. This is the correlation study with NNAT2. At levels A through D, we included 368 students. Both were online administrations, counterbalanced sequence, and again a 1 to 4 week interval between administrations. And I'll show you the details in a second, but the average correlation again is close to 0.78. We did find, let me go ahead and show you the data for that particular study. We did find that after controlling for practice effects, that NAI scores are a few points higher on NNAT3 than on NNAT2. In other words, the NNAT3 norms are a little bit easier than the NNAT2 norms. So this is something, again, that users need to keep in mind when they're interpreting results. This is surprising because the Flynn effect has been known for quite a few decades to demonstrate that on reasoning tests, the general population has been increasing in their performance over the years. And so because of that, norms, every time tests are renormed or new tests are created with new norms, the norms are a bit harder than the norms from previous years because the population has generally been doing better. So here we've seen the opposite of that. We've seen a slight decrease in the performance of the population compared to 9 years ago when NNAT2 was first normed. This is surprising, although it's not completely surprising because there have been other findings recently that indicate some slowdown or possibly even stopping a reversal of the Flynn effect internationally. So we don't, because the Flynn effect is not the causes of the flood effect are not understood. There are many theories, but no real clear knowledge of what has caused the flood effect over the years. It is really difficult to attach any significance or interpretive significance to this effect, to this finding. Okay. We also looked at correlations with the OLSAT, the Otis Lennon School Ability Test, which has two subtests, a verbal subtest and a nonverbal subtest, as well as a total score. And we gave, in the current standardization for the levels A through D, we gave both tests in counterbalanced order to 366 students within a 1 to 4 week, well, actually a 0 to 4 week time interval. And from the NNAT 3 level F, which is the same as the NNAT 2 level F, we have the data from 2007 standardization where they tested 168 students on both forms with a counterbalanced administration. I think I misspoke. Levels A through D, we did not counterbalance. All the students took NNAT 3 first and then took OLSAT 8 second. The correlations are moderately high, and they're especially higher with the nonverbal and with the total scores than with the verbal scores, as one would expect. So we're seeing for the nonverbal, which is the orange line, correlations around 0.6, and the same for the total. And then for the verbal, correlations about 0.5. These are the references regarding marginal reliability. And that concludes the technical description, so we welcome your questions.
Great, thanks, Mark. Well, we have had some questions come in, and if anyone else has a question, you can enter that in your question box at this time and click send. Okay, so here's our first question. It says, I noticed all of your norming is based on the online version. Is there any research into performance on online version versus paper or pencil?
Yes, and we did study that during this norming and also in 2007 with the NNAT 2. And in both cases, we find that there is a difference in performance. Paper and pencil is a little higher, and so the norm, the scoring process adjusts the scores for that, so that results are the same regardless of whether it's paper and pencil or online. And there's if you want to go back and look at the slides, you'll see details about that.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's our next question. It says, what would be an appropriate comparable test for a preschool student?
Well, certainly something like Wexford Preschool and Primary Scale of Intelligence comes to mind. That's individually administered. There are some briefer tests, such as the Kaufman Brief Intelligence Test, which has a mix of verbal and nonverbal, and because the nonverbal is still pictorial rather than abstract figural, it works quite well with students, children down to age 3. And I'm blocking for the moment, but there are some other instruments that would cover a similar range. I don't recall offhand how low the Wexford abbreviated scale of intelligence goes, but that would be similar to the KVIT in terms of having appropriate content.
Great. Okay, thank you. All right, here's our next question. Where can I find the technical manuals?
Carrie?
Yeah, I can take that one. So we have posted the technical manuals on our website. So if you go to pearsonassessments.com/NNAT3 and click on resources, I believe is the tab, you'll see we have the 2 manuals, one for the lower levels and one for the upper levels that are posted there. We've also posted them, if you become a customer of or a user of NNAT3, they're also posted on the platform as well that the NNAT3 is administered on. But you can definitely find them on our website as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, here's our next question. It says, do you recommend using the same size groups you listed for kindergarten, 5 students, and first grade, 10 students? We've been using the NNAT as a universal screener. Should we be testing in these size groups instead of whole class?
Well, this is what we did in our standardization, and we didn't invent it. This is something that we have been following a model that is used previously with other tests. I must say I don't think either Carrie or I has firsthand knowledge of what the limits are for the size of groups that can be used at KN1. So I would say that your experience, if it has worked well with larger groups at KN1, we would certainly not argue that there's anything wrong with that. We were really going on the basis of what we saw other tests having done at these grades.
Thank you. Okay, well, I think those are all of our questions. So that's going to wrap it up. So I'm going to say thank you for your time today, Mark and Carrie. We appreciate you being here. And thank you to all the attendees that have joined us for this session. Please take a moment at the end of this webinar to give your feedback in the survey provided. The survey will appear at the end of the webinar. Also, a follow-up message and link to the recording of this webinar will be emailed out to all participants within a few days. Please feel free to share with your colleagues. On behalf of Pearson, I thank you again for joining us, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.